All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I got another good story for you. But before I get into it and start peeling back some of the different layers that are involved here, because there's a lot of different moving parts to this one, let me just start out first by saying this. When it comes to the type of content that I put out, I tend to stay away from stories that involve rappers or those that are directly involved in social media. I tried my hand at dropping content on the latest hip hop drama and the current vibe when I ran that series called Hip Hop Hot Seat, and I just wasn't getting the type of views that made producing those videos worth the time that I was investing in them. 1.4 thousand, 3.2 thousand, 4.1 thousand, etc., etc. Either my viewers were missing the bus or my videos were straight garbage because those numbers were bad. Either way, I canned that whole series and I went back to doing the type of content that I normally do. As far as social media and reactions on other content creators, it's self-explanatory and it's for the obvious reasons. I just feel like it's an open-ended invitation to get into the back and forth bickering that you see a lot of these other content creators get into. And for me, I'm just not into it. I feel like it's counterproductive towards the message that I'm trying to convey on my channel. But this story right here is a story that I had to cover, because it's a story that kind of merges these two genres together. First, you have the latest buzz about what's going on in the rap game. Then you have the latest buzz about what's going on among some of California's street and prison gangs, the kind of content that I normally cover. And obviously I'm talking about Swifty Blue being targeted by the Mexican Mafia. Anyways, by now there's been a lot of content put out on this story that's been dropped by other content creators all across social media, whether it's been on some of the microblogging platforms such as Twitter and Tumblr, or on other video-based platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. It's a story that's already gained a lot of traction. And rightfully so, because on one hand, you have a reputable criminal organization like the Mexican Mafia that has a well-established reputation across the country for being one of the most violent, feared, highly influential prison organizations in existence. It's a group that has always demanded media coverage no matter what they seem to be involved in. You could have a Mexican Mafia member that got caught for pulling beer runs at local liquor stores in Southern California, and the media would still find a way to make it headline news. But then on the other hand, you have Swifty Blue, a Sureño-based rapper from a street gang in Paramount, California. And let's be honest, I wouldn't say that he attracts a lot of attention based on the success of his music as an aspiring rapper, because he definitely ain't no Tupac, he ain't no Nipsey, and he ain't no Kendrick Lamar. But keeping it real, to his credit, he's someone that's obviously become a household name amongst media platforms across the board. And in comparison to some of the other rappers out there, his music isn't that bad either. So again, it's not because of his music, it's usually because of his antics, or because somebody out there, usually a content creator, who's chasing clout to build up his channel, that's usually either talking about him or running a story about him. I remember the first time I heard about Swifty Blue on YouTube. He was beefing with another rapper whose name I believe is Shady Boy from EMF 13. I can't recall what the issue was between them, but I remember Shady Boy was calling him on his shit behind something that happened on the street. That's the first time I remember hearing his name, and it stood out to me because that's just not a common Picasso that you hear all the time. And from that point on, over the course of time, he gradually became a popular face on social media. Again, whether it was on blogging platforms or video sharing platforms, over the course of time, he inundated social media and became a permanent fixture on the internet. And again, no disrespect to Swifty Blue and his drive to become a successful rap artist. But like I said, I think it was his flamboyant, carefree attitude and his willingness to push the envelope about controversial topics that kind of nudged him into the spotlight. And I think what turned a lot of people down was the level of arrogance that he was always displaying. Some people liked him and others had nothing good to say about him. I personally wouldn't describe Swifty Blue as a hardcore gang member. He might have done some county time and he might have even done a short prison bit, I'm not sure. But he's just not built like someone who's done some real time. Just my opinion though. Who am I to say this when all I have to base this on is the same public persona that he portrays on social media for us all to see. Maybe he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, and maybe he's one of the baddest gangsters that ever walked the face of the earth, or that's ever walked the streets of Paramount. I'm kidding, but all bullshit aside, Swifty just doesn't strike me as being cut from the same cloth as someone who is deeply involved in gangbanging, or someone who legitimately came up in that lifestyle. I see him as someone who might have been exposed to it on some level. Maybe he has some cousins or a Theo that were in the mix, and then through them, eventually it became something that he started to glorify. Then at some point he started to emulate it, got himself a new paint job to harden up his exterior. When I say paint job, I mean his tattoos. And then there you have it. Nelson Abrego, aka Swifty Blue, was created. So as Swifty Blue became more popular on social media and more videos started to come out about him, including some of his interviews on some of the more prominent podcasts on YouTube, such as No Jumper, Cam Capone, and Vlad TV, just to name a few. This is when I started to see that it was just going to be a matter of time before he got himself into a bad wreck, because he started acting like a crash dummy. We all seen it. Then before he started talking about collabing with the Norteño rapper and signing with Gold Toes, he started net banging on Norteños and he talked a lot of his shit. Eventually he apologized for breaking character and for trying to create some waves, but this is all still a part of who he became on the internet. You know, one of the first things I remember he started doing that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way is when he started telling people, mainly other rappers from other states, that they had to check in with him anytime they came to LA. And that if they didn't check in with a reputable gang member like himself, then they ran the risk of being victimized in the streets. I knew he was going to draw some heat for this, but what Swifty didn't understand is that at that time, Sureño rappers were already getting a bad look from the Mexican Mafia, and there were other things that were already in play that he came close to interfering with. Now, let me just say this. Criminal organizations like the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia are criminal organizations that prefer to move in secrecy. No, for the most part, they don't like to be in the spotlight. They're low-key and they prefer to move in the shadows. But don't get that misconstrued. This doesn't mean that they're not involved. A lot of the times, this just means that they're acting as silent partners. You know, anyone that's familiar with that lifestyle knows that Norteño and Sureño rappers started drawing the ire of the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia over the course of the last 15 to 20 years. And that's because this is around the time that Norteño and Sureño rappers started generating the type of revenue that was worth tapping into, that was worth pursuing. Before that, when some of the first so-called pioneers or those that broke ground in that industry had just started, they really weren't making any significant money. They were just scratching the surface. But as time went on and more of these guys got into this industry, some of them tinkered with success. And this is when they got the attention of the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia. And both of these groups basically took up the same position. Surprisingly, it was a position of support. But the support was self-serving. It was only from the viewpoint of how it could benefit these organizations' political self-interest, and then how to maximize that potential. You know, you got to keep in mind that a lot of these homegrown artists were freelancing. They were producing their own music, utilizing their own personal resources, and then they were sandbagging that money, keeping it for themselves. And this is obviously when the problem started. You know, I personally believe that the context of what these guys decided to rap about wouldn't have made a difference one way or the other. It just wouldn't have mattered. Because at some point, they still would have been pressed based on their affiliation alone. They could have rapped about the fish in the sea, the tree in the park, or how green the grass was. It still wouldn't have mattered. But when they started rapping about gang politics and repping the two flags that these two organizations stood on, this right here opened up the door for all the political power plays and changed the dynamics of the whole landscape. Like I said, I believe that eventually they would have been pressed regardless, just based on the fact that they were part of the team. But when they started rapping about gang politics and gang banging, this just made it that much easier. Because these criminal organizations look at it like this. If you're a Sureño or Norteño rapper and you're rapping about that lifestyle and you're representing yourself as being an active gang member in that field, wearing red or blue, putting out videos, throwing up 13 or 14, then you're bearing the fruits of their labors. And this in itself obligates you to make these contributions. Because why should someone be allowed to exploit these things and make money off the spoils of other people's hardships without giving back or making contributions themselves? They feel so strong about this because not only have people fought and died behind this belief system, but others have also made the ultimate sacrifice by catching a life sentence and spending the rest of their natural lives in prison. You know, I'm not going to catalog all the Sureño or Norteño rappers that have been taxed by the Mexican Mafia or the Nuestra Familia, but just trust me, if they were making any significant amounts of money, then they were being pressed and taxed. There's no way around it. You know, I talked about this in one of my previous stories, and it's no secret that King Little G was being taxed by a Mexican Mafia member named Güero Caballo from 18th Street. And under the Mexican Mafia's own protocol, the fact that King Little G's from 18th Street and represents himself as being an active Sureño gives Güero Caballo exclusive taxation rights to collect tax money on behalf of the organization. And the NF has similar protocol. Again, I'm not going to start pulling covers, naming off different rappers that have been taxed, because that's not the purpose of this story. The only reason why I'm even mentioning King Little G is because that was already put out there. But just trust me when I say that there's no way in hell that the Mexican Mafia is going to pass up the opportunity to tax one of these rappers and leave money on the table. One of the unfortunate things about it though is that it stagnates growth and success for any current or future Sureño rappers who might have had the potential to break the norms and become a big name rapper. The political baggage limits that growth and only allows these guys to get so big. Out of all the Sureño rappers that are doing their thing right now, Lefty Gunplay is probably one of the most visible Sureño rappers in the game. And it makes no sense because there's other Sureño rappers that are good rappers, but they're just not getting the type of recognition that they deserve. Do you guys know why that is? Wack 100 said it himself, because of the political baggage and the political fallout that comes with them as a package deal. Nobody's willing to sign any of them regardless to how much potential they might have. Some of these rap labels or record producers, they look at it like this. If you sign these guys and you let them through that door, then you're opening that door up for a whole host of other problems that we don't need. Problems that could include extortion, manipulation, criminal activity, and potential problems with the criminal organization that's just going to continue to keep wanting more and more. That's a mouth that you don't want to start feeding because it's always hungry. Look at it like this. Instead of a rapper pulling up to sign with his agent and maybe a couple of supportive family members, instead you're going to get a fleet of lowriders pulling up with a bunch of guys that are all slung back with ink, and it's going to look like one of those validated group yards in Corcoran Shoe. Why would anyone want to set themselves up for those kind of problems? It's a no-brainer. It's bad business, and nobody wants to deal with all that. And let's be honest, Lefty Gunplay isn't what you would consider to be a highly skilled rapper who has the potential to get any bigger than he is already. His bars are terrible, he can't keep up with the tempo to any song he tries to rap to, and his mental antics are a disaster. No hate, I'm just keeping it real. But despite the train wreck that he is, you can best believe that the Mexican Mafia is still taxing him, and they're still getting a fat percentage of whatever it is that he's making. They see the same things that everyone else sees. Him being flamboyant, flashing wads of cash, wearing all those chains like he's some type of Mexican Flavor Flav. And then there's that ridiculous thing he does, showing off his grill, where he peels his lip back, showing off his iced teeth, something that Swifty does himself. In fact, I think that's another page that he stole from Swifty's playbook. So I don't think Swifty Blue took all these things into consideration when he created these paraphrases like Gangland or the southern side, not the other side. Or when he started telling other people to check in with him and actually even had an application for them to fill out. This is when he started to get in trouble. Not only were people and other rappers saying, who the fuck does this guy think he is? But the Mexican Mafia was also asking themselves this same question. And then later on, when he briefly teamed up with G-Face and they both started pushing this tap in with them before you come to LA movement, I knew for a fact that Swifty Blue was definitely headed for a bad wreck. G-Face was another one of them gang members who was portraying himself to be an active gang member with all this honor and integrity, while at the same time calling other people rats, DOs, and speaking about people that he personally knew who had debriefed and were no longer any good. And for the record, these are some of the most scandalous, grimiest pieces of shit that you can run across. And I'm not speaking about G-Face personally, I'm speaking in general, because there's a lot of cats out there on social media that are doing this. The ones who don't have balls big enough to admit what they themselves have done in the past and are always trying to spin the narrative every which way they can and minimize their own shortcomings. These types of individuals are truly at the bottom of the barrel. They can't claim an ounce of integrity. Anyone that can look directly into the camera and call other people rats, DOs, and talk shit about other people who have debriefed when they've done the same thing themselves, but yet won't admit it, are some of the worst kind of degenerates out there. That right there gets under my skin in one of the worst ways possible. It's just unfortunate that there's so many people out there that don't know any better and who are willing to believe someone for the words that they stand on. But there's some of us that know better. Something else that's always exaggerated by these same types of deceptive individuals pertains to the word leader and how it's conveyed. You got guppies calling themselves leaders based on the fact that they were delegated a position once or twice throughout their entire career. Maybe they were delegated a position once or twice when they were active and it went to their head. It's just a way for them to increase their stock. But that's not what defines a leader. A leader is someone who's placed in a leadership position because of his status and because his own personal accolades have earned him that right. He's someone that can go from prison to prison and take over straight off the bus. Not someone who's at a TS position or someone who's been elevated to a YS position and now they're calling themselves a leader. YouTube's crazy, man, but I guess that's the magical thing about it. People can recreate themselves and be whatever they want to be. But anyways, I'm getting off track. Let me get back to what I was saying about G-Face. Again, when I seen Swifty Blue link up with G-Face, I knew it was just a matter of time before he got himself into a bad wreck. Do you guys remember when Wack 100 confronted G-Face on No Jumper about him cooperating in that case where he supposedly shot at somebody? You know, I knew at that time that G-Face was dirty, but it just wasn't my place to speak on it. You have other channels that like to play the YouTube police. I just thought it was amazing that nobody else knew. His own mannerisms gave him up. All you gotta do is watch somebody and listen to him closely, and they'll tell you themselves. I remember seeing that fool sweat so much on that episode that he had to keep wiping his forehead with the rag that he had in his pocket. And when I seen that episode, something told me that was probably gonna be the last time G-Face was gonna show his face on social media. And he was. So with all this in mind, the case that just recently got 19 people snatched up and charged with conspiracy to whack Swifty Blue claims that this murder plot started as far back as 2022. And that the plot was also allegedly coordinated by a member of the Mexican Mafia and several other high-ranking associates, with coordination occurring in Los Angeles County, within the California prison system, and from inside the LA County Jail. So according to several mainstream media reports, a Mexican Mafia member that was referred to as the Elegant One is the one responsible for putting the green light on Swifty Blue. And before I go any further, let me just say that I had several different sources that helped me with the context of this story. And one of them is an active gang member from Paramount who reached out to me on Instagram. And he told me that he wanted to tell me what he knew about this story, based on the fact that he knew if I put it out there that I wasn't going to leave no stones unturned and that I wasn't going to embellish any of the facts. He provided a lot of context about this story that wasn't covered in the mainstream media, and he also discounted other things that were put out by other people who embellished their stories. You know, some people like to create the illusion that they're deeply connected and they have all these inside facts, and I call bullshit when I see it. It's all part of the catch and release tactic that they use to get you to watch their content. You know, you guys will never hear me tell you not to watch another channel. You guys are entitled to watch whatever you want. And as a content creator, I understand how much work it takes to put into these stories. So watch all content. Just be careful about what you're quick to believe. And you can do your own research by cross-referencing. It's as simple as that. You know, so again, those of you that are watching multiple channels about this story, you guys should be able to connect the dots and call bullshit where you see it. Anyways, I'm sure that you guys have already figured out by now, based on the fact that his name has already been mentioned in the media, that the Elegant One is a reference to Mexican Mafia member Manuel Quintero, who also goes by the name Snuffy from Paramount. You know, supposedly the Elegant One was a name other Mexican Mafia members started using in good humor to describe Snuffy after seeing several pictures of him at a nightclub all decked out in elegant attire. So although this was apparently derived from a conversation that took place in good faith on the tier, it actually ended up being an inside method that was used to describe Snuffy amongst only a select few that knew about that name. How it got leaked out to law enforcement is a mystery, but you guys know how that goes. So based on the fact that Snuffy is also a longtime member of the Paramount Barrio gang, he held the same kind of taxation rights over Swifty Blue that I told you Güero Cobayo held over King Little G. And from what I was told, since as far back as 2022, Swifty continued to lie, deceive, and do everything he could to avoid from giving Snuffy an accurate percentage of what he was really making. So apparently Swifty was fudging the numbers and wasn't being honest about his finances because he didn't want to pay Snuffy what he was asking for. You know what it all boils down to is Swifty had the type of mentality that made it hard for him to pay taxes on money that he righteously felt that he made himself. And he did, but there's exceptions to that. You know, he didn't agree with the logic of why he should be permitted to pay taxes to a criminal organization that had a vested interest in the things that he rapped about. He didn't get it, nor did he agree with why representing himself as an active Sureño should obligate him to pay taxes to the same criminal organization that founded the movement that he was involved in. So this in turn prompted Snuffy to open up an investigation and look into the books of Swifty's finances. I don't know all the intricate details, but apparently Snuffy felt like he was being deceived. He felt like Swifty was lying to him and he wasn't being honest. And supposedly there was something mentioned about a lowrider that Swifty used in one of his rap videos, and he didn't compensate the owner. And somehow Snuffy was involved in that. So eventually it got to the point where Snuffy ended up losing his patience and decided that enough was enough. That he was done being lied to, and that Swifty obviously didn't respect his authority as a reputable member of the Mexican Mafia. My source also said that Swifty felt like he had some latitude and that he had some room to maneuver based on the fact that Snuffy was also from Paramount. I guess because they were from the same hood, felt like he had some room to wiggle. But obviously, this is where he miscalculated Snuffy, because Snuffy was treating him like anyone else. So on New Year's Eve of 2022, allegedly acting under the orders of Snuffy, one of his enforcers, an individual by the name of CASHAPP, also known as Clever, began notifying gang members on the streets of Paramount, Compton, and downtown LA that they had instructions to take flight on Swifty Blue on site whenever they seen him. It's a mystery as to whether or not Swifty Blue knew that he had this impending green light that was placed on him, but during this time, he managed to keep a low profile and he kept his head down. In the meantime, after Clever initially filtered out Snuffy's directive targeting Swifty on site, Clever apparently warned someone else through a TikTok message to stay away from Swifty. The message went on to say verbatim, "Let me give you a little 411 so you won't be misguided by the internet. Swifty's career is done. I talked to him and tried to guide him, but he didn't listen. Now he's getting his blues in Men's Central Jail." I tried to do some digging, trying to find out how law enforcement became aware of this message that was given on TikTok, but I couldn't find nothing. However, it's gotta make you wonder though, because either they intercepted it on a contraband cell phone that was being used to communicate, or what we all already know, that they're all over the internet and they're paying attention. So up until this point, Swifty obviously managed to elude from becoming a target. However, in November of 2023, after getting pulled over and getting caught with a gun and some D, his luck ran out when he was housed in the LA County Jail. And if he knew he was in trouble, he didn't act on it and he didn't request protective custody because they housed him on an active tier with other active gang members. One of those gang members, Monsino Gonzalez, who also went by the name Vamps, was on the same tier as Swifty, 2 cells down. And when Swifty landed on the tier, Vamps called his mom, Dominga Gonzalez, and asked her if the one that sings was still good. And this was obviously a reference to Swifty that was used in the loose form of a code to avoid from having to openly say his name on the phone. So at that point, Vamp's mom, Dominga, she hangs up, makes a couple of phone calls to confirm Swifty's status, and then a few minutes later, Vamps calls her back and she confirms that the green light is still on. And all this was recorded. I'm sure there's probably some people that would say that Vamp's mom, Dominga, knew what she was getting herself into and that she became a willing participant under her own volition. But here's the sad part. Those of us that were part of this lifestyle and those of us who involved some of our family members in this same type of business know full and well that the only reason that they did get involved is out of the love and respect that they had for us as family. We can't expect them to know the true extent of what they're getting involved in until we lead them out in deep waters and it becomes too late. They're not the ones that made a commitment to that lifestyle. We did. So shame on anyone who did that, including myself. I'd feel like shit if I got my own mother, grandmother, or other family members drug into the courtroom on account of my own indiscretions. I'm lucky that this never happened to me, but unfortunately for Vamps and his mom, the context of this short conversation where he's just trying to get clarity on his status ended up getting them both charged with conspiracy. Just think about that for a minute. That's all they need to drag you into a case like this. So if you're an active gang member and you're somebody that's still in the mix, you might want to make a mental note of this, because it's ridiculous how easy it's becoming for law enforcement to put a case like this on you, or to hit anyone with a gang enhancement, a 186.22 A or B, for just about anything that they can articulate was done for the sole purpose of benefiting at the direction of or in association of a criminal street gang. So a couple days after Vamps and his mom have this conversation on the phone, another active gang member in the LA County Jail, an individual by the name of Jonathan Cavito, who also went by the moniker Dreamer, was also doing his due diligence, trying to find out whether or not the green light was still on Swifty. Dreamer made a call to another inmate that was housed at Kern Valley State State Prison. And based on the context of the conversation, it sounded like this individual, Jacob David, who was referred to as Eagle, had some status and might possibly have been a member of the Mexican Mafia. You know, it's not clear whether or not Dreamer was calling from a recorded county jail phone or whether he had his own contraband cell phone. But the individual that he was calling, Eagle, answered from a contraband cell phone that he had himself. So after Dreamer mentions Swifty Blue by name and confirms that he's there in the county jail, Dreamer then asks Eagle if he remembers another Sureño rapper that got it in the shower. And this was obviously a reference to Jaime Brigada Valdez, who was also a rapper that went by Money Sign Suede. And he was stabbed to death in the showers at Correctional Training Facility, CTF, Soledad in 2023. You know, I didn't run a story on this incident when it happened because there was already a lot of other content that had been dropped by other YouTubers. But I do remember hearing about the details of this incident, and from what I remember, they butchered this youngster in the showers. I mean, all prison stabbings are violent, and sometimes they might even be hard to watch. But his was bad, and it seemed like it was personal. You know, this is something else that I just elaborated on in one of my recent stories. But for those of you that haven't been to prison, just trust me when I tell you that some of the weapons that are crafted and manufactured in there are similar to some of the knives that you have right now in your kitchen drawer. I mean, they're the type of weapons that when you see them and you hold them in your hand, almost instinctively you'll say, man, whoever gets hit with this is done. I'll post some pictures. Matter of fact, you should be looking at some right now, but pictures don't do no justice. You have to see them in person to really appreciate how bad they are. So after Dreamer alludes to the incident involving Money Sign Suede and how he was butchered in the shower, Dreamer and Eagle talk about putting a crew of shooters together to carry out the hit on Swifty. So the following day, after the initial call, Dreamer places a second call to Eagle, and they follow up on the conversation that they had about Swifty. And then at some point during the call, Eagle responds by telling Dreamer to advise the shooters that this hit is to be done with extreme prejudice. He says verbatim, handle that shit with prejudice. You know how the legal term prejudice is used in court? Well, this is to be done with prejudice. The message that Eagle was trying to convey to Dreamer was basically to tell the shooters to kill Swifty without actually saying the word kill himself. That's about as close as he could come to saying it. And when he emphasized the word prejudice twice, he was basically saying to muster up as much hate and rage as you possibly can, and then to inflict some medieval type of shit where he was butchered the same way Money Sign Suede was. No, this right here is the same kind of context that's being implemented on level 3 and 4 mainlines. They're telling these youngsters that when they engage a target to keep hitting them until he's completely immobilized or he's no longer moving. Otherwise, if they fail the mission and pull back before the job's done, then they themselves run the risk of becoming the next target. And again, the days of using tomahawks, plastic stock, or flimsy pieces of metal are long gone and in the past. Now it's exclusively bone crushers with diamond tip points that are usually inspected and cleared by leadership before they're added to the household stockpile. So getting back to the conversation between Dreamer and Eagle, after the situation with Swifty was addressed, Dreamer acknowledged that a plan was already being put in motion, and apparently no time was wasted, because the following morning at 5:50 a.m. when they started letting inmates out who wanted to take a shower, 3 shooters, Adrian Bueno, who's also known as Slick, Andrew Shania, who they called Largo, and Jude Valle, who also went by Crazy, all came out and made a beeline for Swifty's cell to carry out the assignment. A 4th individual named Michael Ortiz, who also went by Weasel, was delegated as the point man. It was his job to watch for any deputies that might have entered the unit and to also obstruct the view of one of the jail security cameras that had a clear vantage point of Swifty's cell. So about 5 hours after Dreamer talked to Eagle, he jumps back on the phone and is overheard talking on a recorded line to a female. And he tells the female to relay a message back to Eagle in prison that old boy got his rap session. This was obviously confirmation that the hit on Swifty was carried out, but he also added that it wasn't a good show, indicative that the hit wasn't a good hit. He concluded the message by saying, expect them to be performing probably on the 4,000 floor, which was another area of the jail. Now, this obviously meant that their people on the 4th floor were probably going to make a second attempt on trying to hit Swifty. But this apparently never happened, and Swifty ended up bailing out. So out of the 19 people that were implicated in this conspiracy, everybody was arrested with the exception of one individual, and that was a guy by the name of Joshua Ian, who's also known as Demon. And as far as I know, up until a few days ago, before he decided to turn himself in, he was considered to be a fugitive and the only one who hadn't been arrested at that time. I'm sure there was some disappointment based on the fact that the shooters fumbled the ball and failed to take Swifty out, but unfortunately sometimes that's just the way that it goes. However, I'm sure that everyone that was involved knew that sooner or later they'd get another chance and that Swifty's luck would eventually run out. You can only navigate and maneuver in your territory for so long, but sooner or later, if you keep coming around, if you're a celebrity and you're still out there performing, nobody can survive on the streets of Southern California for too long, green-lighted by the Mexican Mafia. Sooner or later, they're gonna get you. And Swifty, he's too recognizable. Sooner or later, somebody's gonna catch him. Clever, he obviously thought that opportunity was gonna come sometime in March of 2024. At that time, he was still in constant contact with Demon, who was still a fugitive and hadn't been arrested yet. And supposedly Demon allegedly vowed that he'd catch Swifty before they arrested him. And this was something that he remained resolute about. Then at one point, Clever became aware of the fact that Swifty was recording a live stream right outside of his family's home. This just seemed like it was too good to be true. Even Swifty wouldn't be that stupid. But yet, he still communicated this to Demon through a TikTok message saying that it's happening right now. He's filming right now as we speak. So despite the fact that it was 1 a.m. in the morning, Demon allegedly drove to Swifty's family's house and then claimed that nobody was there. And according to the complaint, he even sent a picture back to Clever showing him a gun in his car's cup holder to show him that he was ready and willing. So don't let the tapatio fool you. Under the circumstances, why would Swifty be that sloppy knowing that they were gunning for him? And why would anyone be outside his family's house at 1 a.m. in the morning? In closing, the question now is what happens to Swifty Blue's career from this point on? Like I said earlier, there's just no way he can continue to survive out there in Southern California with a target on his back by a group like the Mexican Mafia. Despite the fact that there's a lot of 2-5ers, DOs, and dropouts out there in Southern California, we're talking about a performer, somebody that's always out in the spotlight. And Swifty's own indiscretions have definitely created waves that have disturbed the status quo. Tekashi 6ix9ine is a prime example of what happens when adversity and political fallout is just too much to overcome. You can't perform and be a music artist with that kind of political baggage. Nobody's gonna want to be around you either. He had aspirations to get out of jail and to continue pursuing his career as a rap artist, despite all the people he had burned and despite everything that he had done. But eventually he learned that there was just too many obstacles that he helped create himself. And although he made a lot of enemies and the threat level with the Bloods was real, it didn't come nowhere near the likes of the Mexican Mafia. But with all this in mind, this is just another self-inflicted black eye for all the Mexican rap artists who have been trying to claw their way into an industry that has been dominated by those who righteously created it, the black rappers. For every 10 feet of ground the Mexican rappers have gained, they end up losing another 50 behind somebody else's shenanigans, whether it was because somebody passed away or behind somebody else getting caught up in some controversial bullshit. Look at all the hits that the Southern rappers have already taken. Blackie Fontana from Fontana, Wreck from 18th Street, Night Out from Walktown, Money Sign Suede from South Central, or like others would say, technically a resident, Toker from Brownside, Sucker Free from Lenox, Diablo from Banning, just to name a few. People are already calling Swifty Blue a dropout, while others are saying, how can he be a dropout when he never dropped in? Come on, people, they don't mean in the literal sense, they mean in the figurative sense, that he's basically no good and he's open game. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for also continuing to tap into the channel. Until the next one, you guys keep pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your day. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.